All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Module 11. Uh, this week we're going to talk about target hardening. Last module we talked about certain vulnerabilities, different porous nodes. Where uh, extremists may either attack or take advantage to get into the country. So this time we're going to talk about how do you harden these targets. So target hardening as a concept is an anti-terrorist measure that just simply makes potential targets more difficult to attack. So the Homeland Security enterprise is constantly trying to find ways to harden targets. How do you make things harder and more difficult for terrorists to attack? How do you make these soft targets hard targets? So things like international borders, ports of entry, transportation systems, information technologies, anything that could possibly be a target for a terrorist is something that they're thinking about how to possibly harden it. Easier said than done. Okay, hardening targets is really difficult because you have these main categories of targets, but then within each of those main categories, you have all these other different targets within it, and each of them poses these unique challenges, right? Every potential target is going to have different things about it that are going to make it difficult to try to to try to harden it. So you can't have this one size fits all, like this is what we're going to do to harden targets. Okay, it's very, very target specific. All right, so first thing we're going to talk about is cybersecurity. Um, the internet is everywhere. It's a universal component of pretty much everything, right? Everything is on the internet. Everybody's using the internet. Um, everyone has it. Okay, so obviously extremists also have it. So it's a common feature of the modern terrorist environment. They use it to facilitate networking. They distribute propaganda. They communicate. They raise money. Like they use the internet for just about everything. So if there's a targeted attack on some kind of computer system or network, uh, it can really cause a lot of disruption. It doesn't take long to look in the news either. To find cyber attacks. Where someone attacked not necessarily a terrorist, but just a hacker. Ransomware or something like that. Think about the disruption that those things cause, right? So cybersecurity is a really, really important feature when you're talking about target hardening. All right. So there's different terms that you're going to hear when you're talking about cyber security. So there's cyber attacks, which is a deliberate computer-to-computer attack that disrupts or destroys or takes over a computer system or damages information, steals information. Okay, so that's a cyber attack. Cyber war uh, is this mode of warfare where terrorists use technologies to destroy networks and infrastructures or to somehow deter them from waging a cyber attack on their own. Okay, and this usually happens, at the state actor level. Like this is a country level kind of thing. Hacktivism. Uh, this is a form of contentious politics. Non-state actors do this to support any variety of political, social, or religious causes. Frequently in opposition to some kind of government policy. A group that does this is the group that call themselves anonymous. Okay, they're examples of a group that participates in hacktivism. Then you have cyber terrorism, which is a computer generated attack that targets other computers in cyberspace or the information they contain. Some believe that cyber terrorism is going to eventually replace conventional conflicts over territory or people. They think future wars are going to be fought in cyberspace rather than boots on the ground. So cyber attacks have really started uh, coming to the fore since about 1998. Prior to that, the internet really wasn't much. People didn't have it. Stuff wasn't computerized. So about 1998 is when things started really kind of picking up, where everything was starting to go online. Um, so there have been increasing cyber attacks, since about that time. So when you're talking about this modern terrorist environment and modern terror threats, uh, cyber terrorism is one of the biggest ones. So who do they target? You know, Private corporations. It's really uh, anybody that they think has something that they want, right? So you're talking about private corporations, telecommunications companies, government agencies, attacks on the grid, which could affect urban centers or entire regions. Um, Government targets, looking for both disruption and also stealing information. So if you're thinking about this, I mean, it's particularly concerning when you're talking about defense industry. Not only just the Department of Defense, but what about private defense industry? So they have all this information, but they're a private corporation, so you have this kind of overlap here. So they're always constantly looking for potential targets or potential vulnerabilities they can exploit. So what's the feasibility of all this? So feasibility and likelihood are similar, but not the same kind of concept. So the feasibility of terrorists acquiring and using technology really just depends on the availability of those technologies. Okay, acquiring new technology a lot of times requires some kind of special access or knowledge, so therefore they're not always available. But like everything else, if there's a will, there's a way. Like if somebody wants something, they're going to get it or figure out a way to get it. Um, there's a lot of information already available on the internet. Bomb assembly, poisoning stuff, weapons construction, information about how to hack, like all that stuff is floating around on the internet. So um, finding those kind of things is not too difficult for terrorists anymore. Uh, but likelihood is in a different discussion than feasibility. So terrorists have already acquired many kinds of technology and have already used some. So the likelihood that they're going to find them and use them and acquire them is very, very good, right? So as technology develops and becomes more available, uh, the likelihood that terrorists get their hands on stuff uh, is pretty high. So how do you harden cyberspace? Okay, we talk about target hardening. You think about that monument. What are we going to do to harden that monument? Well, but cyberspace is a little bit different, right? Because it's just kind of this amorphous, kind of nebulous thing. So there's an anti-terrorist option. Um, in 2001, President Obama signed an executive order that allowed computer-initiated action against adversaries. So stuff like espionage, aggressive cyber attacks. Um, the objective was to uh, embed the cyber technology into American warfighting capabilities. Stuff like uploading viruses, hacking sites, neutralizing communication systems, defense grids, that kind of stuff. As well as electronic information maintained or sent by extremists or terrorists can also be intercepted. We use modern surveillance technology to harden cyberspace. Digital technologies, fiber optics, satellite communications, all those things have allowed surveillance to be conducted remotely. So these surveillance technologies are now central components of counterterrorist systems. Uh, they're able to access private electronic transactions, computer transactions, social media, credit cards, things like digital fingerprinting, facial imaging, iris scans, like all these biometrics. All this stuff is now included in these modern surveillance technologies and are available for use in counterterrorism. But here's the catch. A lot of those things that we're talking about, especially when you get into the biometric stuff, is considered to be really intrusive. So politicians and civil libertarian organizations really have had a lot of questions about should we be using these things? How much are we allowed to use those things? How much will people support us using those kinds of technologies? All right, so that's cyber terrorism, cyber space, hardening cyberspace. Let's talk about something a little more concrete. How do you harden critical infrastructure? So again, critical infrastructure, like we talked about before, are asset systems and networks, either physical or virtual, that are so vital to the United States that if something happens to them, it would really have a debilitating effect on the United States as a whole. Security, economic security, public health, right? Any combination of those things. So the DHS Office of Infrastructure Protection is the one who oversees the designing, implementing of these policies and programs for protecting critical infrastructures. There's presidential directives, there's Homeland Security policy directives. Know those. I'm not going to go into all of those, but know those, know what they do, and how they relate to this. All right, so if we're going to secure critical infrastructure, we need to harden targets. So that is used to deter terrorists from selecting certain targets. But these aren't long-term solutions. Okay, they provide immediate protection, but oftentimes they're not long-term solutions. So increasing airport security. So say we get some intelligence that there's going to be something happening at the airport. Well, you increase airport security, or you have this visible deployment of security personnel. Those kinds of things harden targets, but those aren't things that can continue indefinitely. All right, the public-private context. So you have all these critical infrastructure sectors. So they form the core of this National Infrastructure Protection Plan, which plans the protocols for protecting all these infrastructure sectors. Well, the private sector, these are not just government infrastructure, right? A lot of this has to do with the private sector as well. So if there's a terrorist incident against any of these 16 sectors, there'll be serious ramifications then also for the private sector. So there's got to be a public-private cooperation working to secure these critical infrastructures. DHS also has a Building and Infrastructure Protection Series, which is a series of manuals that DHS uses to report recommendations for protecting buildings and infrastructure. They're practice manuals. They're published in this All Hazard series, so it contains domestic security, like preventing structures from collapsing, reference manual to mitigate potential terrorist attacks. Okay, so there's a variety of different building and infrastructure protection series manuals. So if you're wanting to harden a target, what kind of options are available? What are the things that you can do to target harden some critical infrastructure? Okay, one is to create a perimeter around it. And that's a pretty common one that you see. They can use urban design features and landscaping, make use of glazing techniques for installing glass, install architectural barriers, employ personnel, install electronic warning and detection, electronic access controls. Those are all things that you can use to harden targets. And there's 1,000 more, right? Because each of these critical infrastructure is going to be unique. So each of them will have their own set of things, but those are just a few examples of ways that you can do it. All right, transportation security. How do you harden transportation security? Well, we already talked some about aviation, right, and the porous nodes. So you have the TSA. They're the ones that provide leadership for securing transportation while collaborating with the Department of Transportation and the Coast Guard. Now, the TSA is not just responsible for aviation. They're responsible for transportation in general. Aviation, you've got like 20,000 airports, 500 of which are commercial. You have the FAA that administers civil aviations. So you have security, and you got to have safety of passengers, but also for timely delivery of cargo. You have motor transportation networks. Okay, you're talking about commercial and private vehicles on roadways and highways. You got to have this movement, right? Think about if we didn't have trucks hauling cargo across the country. Right, so the movement of these vehicles is very, very important. People traveling, people going and spending money places, people going to the store. Like people have to be able to move. So if you're going to harden those kind of networks, you're probably going to focus on things like choke points, like border crossings, bridges, terminals, tunnels. Places that are going to significantly disrupt movement of vehicles across the country. You have railways to think about. Okay. Now, railways are not a huge, like at least coast to coast, are not used a lot for people. Now, Amtrak does move people. People do take commuter trains, but you get into the bigger cities, especially like on the East Coast, you have a lot of commuter trains. So those are also very important to consider. But you have these large amounts of freight also moving on the railroad. You have hazardous waste moving on the railroad. Railways are particularly interesting because you have like 500 railroad companies. So they all have to collaborate in conjunction with the federal government to work on security for the railways. And just as a reminder again, the TSA been responsible since 2002. It replaced the private screening process that there was before 9/11. TSA does include the Federal Air Marshal Service, but nobody knows the size or number of marshals or how often they're on an aircraft. All that stuff is classified. TSA does have 30,000 personnel, screeners, law enforcement agents, and airport security staff. All right, that brings us to the end of Module 11. Please make sure to complete your assignments for this module and let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next module.